The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light filled the observation deck, bouncing off the metal walls of my ship, the Vera. I am Korvath, a scout of the Ashen Accord, and in that moment, every instinct in my body told me to run. But I did not run. I stayed at my post, because that is what scouts do. We watch, we record, we survive by staying quiet and small. That night, quiet and small were not going to be enough. My sensors had picked up a signal from a system we had marked as empty only a few cycles ago. A new species had crossed into the void, moving faster than any of our models predicted possible for a species so young. I pulled up the data with shaking claws. The species called themselves humans. Their homeworld was a small blue planet, barely worth a footnote in our star charts. Our analysts had studied them for years from a distance, quietly, the way we studied every new species before deciding whether to greet them or erase them. The reports on humans were almost comical. Soft skin, no claws, no natural armor, weak eyesight in the dark. Short lives, barely 100 cycles before their bodies simply stopped working. My commander, an old and proud member of our fleet named Salith Kor, laughed when the first files came across her desk. "They building starships," she said, her voice thick with amusement. "With arms like that." I remember laughing too. I am ashamed of that now. Our fleet had encountered dozens of new species over the centuries. Some were fierce, some were clever, some had claws sharper than ours, or scales that could stop a blast bolt, or minds that could calculate battle formations faster than our best strategists. Humans had none of that. Our first scans showed weapons that were, by our standards, embarrassingly primitive. Metal shells fired by explosive powder, engines that still relied on burning fuel instead of folding space. When the Council reviewed the files, the decision was almost instant. Humans were not a threat. They were a curiosity, nothing more. I was assigned to lead a small observation team to their outer colony, a mining station called Haven Ridge, built on a moon at the edge of their claimed territory. My orders were simple. Watch, record their behavior, do not engage. It sounded like the easiest assignment of my career. The Vera dropped out of the fold 3 days later, hidden behind the dark side of a nearby asteroid belt. From there, we had a clear view of Haven Ridge. It was smaller than I expected, a cluster of metal domes connected by narrow tunnels, surrounded by mining equipment that looked worn down and patched together more times than I could count. Lights blinked along its surface, steady and calm, like a small heartbeat in the darkness of space. I watched the humans for 2 full days before anything strange happened. Their daily patterns were almost boring to record. They worked long hours. They ate together in a shared hall. They laughed loudly, in a way that echoed strangely through our audio sensors, nothing like the polite and measured sounds most species made. They argued sometimes, then apologized minutes later, as if the argument had never mattered at all. I began to think this assignment truly was as simple as it looked. Then, on the 3rd day, one of their patrol ships noticed us. It should not have been possible. Our cloaking systems were designed to hide us from species far more advanced than humans. Our engineers had spent decades perfecting the technology, testing it against sensors used by species twice as old as the Accord itself. Yet somehow, a small human vessel, barely larger than a supply shuttle, turned directly toward our position and held steady, as if it could see us clearly through the void. "They cannot have detected us," said my second-in-command, a quiet and careful officer named Dren Isk. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "Not with technology like theirs." I did not answer him right away. I was watching the human ship on our display, watching it hang motionless in space, facing us directly. There was no way to know for certain if they saw us, or if it was simply an odd coincidence, a routine patrol that happened to pause in our direction. I told myself it was the second option. I wanted to believe it was the second option. We waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. The human ship did not move, did not fire, did not call for reinforcements. It simply sat there, engines idle, as if studying us the same way we had been studying them. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a feeling I did not have a name for at the time. Later, I would learn to call it fear. Eventually, the ship turned and drifted back toward Haven Ridge, its lights blinking in a slow, steady rhythm. My crew let out a collective breath, the tension in the observation deck easing like a held muscle finally relaxing. I did not relax. I kept watching the empty space where the ship had been, unable to shake the feeling that we had been seen, truly seen, and simply allowed to remain. I sent a report to Commander Kor that night, describing the encounter in careful detail. Her response came back within the hour, short and dismissive. "Curiosity, not threat," she wrote. "Continue observation. Humans are known to investigate anomalies. This is expected behavior, not evidence of advanced detection." I wanted to believe her. She was older than me, more experienced, someone who had survived encounters with far stranger and more dangerous species than a soft-skinned race from a small blue world. If she said it was nothing, then perhaps it truly was nothing. But that night, alone in my quarters, I reviewed the footage again and again. I studied the human ship, its worn metal hull, its mismatched thruster ports clearly repaired more than once. This was not an advanced vessel. It carried no weapon systems that our scanners could detect, no shielding beyond simple hull plating. By every measure we used to judge strength, this ship should have posed no threat at all, yet it had found us, and it had not been afraid. I began paying closer attention after that, watching not just their technology but their behavior. I noticed things I had missed before. The way the workers moved with purpose, even during their rest periods, always aware of their surroundings. The way their communications, even the casual ones between friends, carried an odd discipline beneath the humor, as if every person on that station understood, without needing to be told, exactly what to do if something went wrong. I noticed how their children, the few who lived on the station with their families, were taught early to recognize the warning sounds of different alarms, drilled calmly and without panic, like it was simply part of growing up. On the 5th day, I watched a mining accident unfold on the surface of the moon. A support strut collapsed, trapping 2 workers beneath fallen equipment. I expected panic. Instead, I watched a dozen humans arrive within minutes, working together with a speed and calm that startled me. There was no shouting, no confusion, only quick decisions and steady hands. They freed both workers within the hour. One of the injured, a woman with short dark hair named Priya, was already joking with her rescuers before the medical team even arrived, her voice light despite the pain I could see clearly on her face. I found myself recording notes I had not been asked to record. Observations about resilience, about how quickly they recovered from setbacks, about the strange bond they seemed to share even with people they had only just met. My scientific curiosity, the very thing that made me suited for scout work, began to turn into something else. Something closer to respect, though I would not have called it that at the time. 6 days into our observation, Commander Kor contacted me with new orders. The Council had reviewed our reports and decided it was time to make contact, quietly and carefully, through a small diplomatic gesture. A single unarmed shuttle would approach Haven Ridge, carrying a simple greeting message and an offer of trade. It was meant to be the gentlest possible introduction, a way to test the waters before any larger decisions were made about humanity's place among the known species. I did not like the timing. Something about the calm discipline I had witnessed on that station made me uneasy about approaching them so soon, so directly. But orders were orders, and I was young enough in my position to trust that those above me understood the risks better than I did. The shuttle launched the next morning, carrying 2 of my crew members and a simple recorded greeting in the human's own language, painstakingly translated by our linguistic officers over the previous days. I watched from the Vera as it approached Haven Ridge, its lights soft and unthreatening against the dark backdrop of space. For a moment, everything seemed calm. The station's automated defenses, such as they were, did not activate. No alarms sounded. The shuttle drew closer, close enough now that I could see individual figures moving along the station's observation windows, watching the approaching craft with what I assumed was simple curiosity. Then, without warning, something went wrong. A junior officer aboard a nearby patrol vessel, new to deep space assignments and unfamiliar with the layout of a mining station, misread a routine equipment test as a weapons launch. In a moment of panic, believing our shuttle was under attack, he fired a single warning shot toward the station, intended only to distract and allow our shuttle to retreat safely. It struck a fuel storage tank near the station's outer ring. The explosion was small by any military standard, barely enough to scorch the outer hull plating, but it was enough. Alarms blared across Haven Ridge, and within seconds, the calm I had observed for 6 days vanished, replaced by something far more focused and far more dangerous than panic. I watched, frozen, as human ships that had been docked peacefully only moments before began powering up, their engines glowing to life with a speed that defied everything our reports had told us about their technology. I keyed my comm immediately, shouting orders to recall the patrol vessel, to signal a ceasefire, to do anything to stop what was unfolding. But it was already too late. The first human ship had launched, and it was not retreating toward safety. It was heading directly toward us. I remember staring at the display, watching that single small vessel accelerate toward our fleet, and feeling, for the first time in my long career as a scout, truly and completely afraid. Not because the ship was powerful. By every measure we understood, it was not. But because of the calm, steady confidence with which it approached, as if the pilot inside had already decided, without hesitation, exactly what needed to happen next. I did not yet understand what that confidence meant. I would learn soon enough. What I had mistaken for a fragile and primitive species was something else entirely, something our scans and reports had never been able to measure. We had judged humans by their weapons, their technology, their short and fragile lives. We had never once considered what might happen when a species like that decided it had nothing left to lose. That single warning shot, fired by a nervous young officer who only wanted to protect his crew, was the spark that would end almost everything I had ever known. I did not know it yet, sitting there on the observation deck of the Vera, watching a lone human ship close the distance between us. I only knew that the calm, patient curiosity I had observed for 6 days had shifted into something sharper, something focused entirely on us. And it was not afraid. The last thing I recorded before the first true engagement began was a single line, scrawled quickly into my personal log, more instinct than analysis. I have kept that line with me ever since, through everything that followed. They are not weak, they are simply patient, and patience, I would soon learn, is the most dangerous weapon of all. The human ship closed the distance faster than our tracking systems could recalculate. I stood frozen on the observation deck, watching the small vessel weave between debris from the explosion, its movements sharp and precise, nothing like the sluggish, cautious approach our simulations had predicted for a species with such limited experience in deep space combat. Commander Kor's voice cut through the chaos on the bridge, steady, despite the alarm still blaring around us. Hold position. Do not fire unless fired upon. This is still recoverable. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that a simple apology, a clear signal of our peaceful intent, could undo the accident that had just occurred. I opened a channel, broadcasting on every frequency our linguistic officers had identified as common among human vessels, repeating the same message over and over. We mean no harm. The attack was a mistake. We wish to speak. There was no response. The human ship continued its approach, and within moments, it was close enough that I could see its outline clearly on our forward viewport, small and unassuming against the vastness of space. Then it opened fire. The first shot struck our patrol vessel, the same one whose officer had fired the warning shot that started everything. I watched the ship's shields flare and hold, then flare again as a second volley struck the same section, weakening it further. Our vessel returned fire, its weapons far more powerful by every measure we understood, yet the human ship moved with an agility that made most of our shots miss entirely. Curving and dodging through space, with a precision that seemed almost impossible for a craft of its size and age. "Their pilot," Dren Isk said beside me, his voice tight with disbelief. "He is flying manually, no computer assistance. I am reading no automated targeting systems at all." I did not answer him. I was too busy watching our patrol vessel's shields collapse under a third volley, followed almost immediately by a fourth that tore through the ship's hull near its engine core. The vessel began to drift, power failing across its systems, and I realized with growing horror that we were losing, not because the human ship was more powerful, but because its pilot understood exactly where and how to strike. Commander Kor ordered 2 more vessels to intercept, hoping to overwhelm the single human ship with numbers. I watched as they moved into position, weapons charging, confident in the simple mathematics of the situation. 3 ships against 1. It should have ended quickly. It did not. The human pilot broke away from the crippled patrol vessel and turned to face the 2 new arrivals, and for a moment I thought perhaps this was the end, that surely now the human would retreat, recognizing the impossible odds stacked against a single small craft. Instead, the ship accelerated directly toward the gap between our 2 vessels, weapons firing in short, precise bursts that struck weak points along both hulls, areas our own engineers would have known to protect more carefully, areas that a species unfamiliar with our ship designs should not have been able to identify so quickly. "How does it know where to strike?" I whispered, more to myself than to anyone listening. I would learn later that the human pilot, a young woman named Nora Bell, had studied the wreckage of our crippled patrol vessel in the brief seconds before her attack, using nothing more advanced than her own eyes and a targeting system built from technology decades behind our own. She had simply looked, understood, and adapted, all within moments, while our systems were still calculating probabilities and running simulations. By the time reinforcements from Haven Ridge arrived, 4 more human vessels joining the fight, our own forces had already lost 2 ships and severely damaged a third. Commander Kor's voice, when it finally broke through the chaos again, carried none of its earlier calm confidence. "Full retreat," she ordered. "All vessels, disengage and return to the fold point. We are leaving this system." I remember the strange mixture of relief and shame I felt as the Vera turned away from Haven Ridge, our remaining fleet scattering into the darkness to avoid further engagement. Relief, because I had genuinely believed, for the first time in the encounter, that we might not survive the retreat. Shame, because I understood, even then, that we were running from a species we had dismissed as harmless only days before. The human ships did not pursue us far. They held their position near the edge of the system, watching as our fleet withdrew, making no attempt to chase us down or press their advantage further. I found that restraint more unsettling than if they had continued the attack. It suggested a level of discipline and control that did not match the desperate, chaotic image of humanity our early reports had painted. We regrouped 3 systems away, in a quiet stretch of space far from any inhabited world, and Commander Kor called an emergency council with every officer aboard the Vera. The mood in the briefing room was tense, the kind of silence that comes after something has gone deeply, irreversibly wrong. "We lost 2 ships," said Dren Isk, reading from the casualty reports with a voice that trembled slightly despite his effort to remain steady. 11 crew members. A third vessel is severely damaged and will require weeks of repair before it can return to active duty. "And the humans?" Commander Kor asked. "What were their losses?" Dren hesitated before answering. "None, as far as our sensors could determine. Their ships sustained damage, but none were destroyed or disabled." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced in my career. We had entered that system with 5 vessels, confident in our technological superiority, and left with 2 ships crippled and 11 lives lost, against a species we had judged, only a week earlier, as barely worth the effort of proper observation. I spoke up then, something I rarely did in council meetings, my rank too junior to warrant much attention from senior officers. "We misjudged them," I said. "Not their strength, their nature. We measured their weapons and their technology, but we never considered what kind of species they actually are underneath all of that. Commander Kor studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Explain," she said simply. I gathered my thoughts, drawing on everything I had observed during our 6 days watching Haven Ridge. Every species we have encountered before now has a breaking point, a moment where the risk becomes too great, where retreat becomes the only logical choice. We build our strategies around finding that point and pushing an enemy past it. But I watched these humans for 6 days before the conflict began. I watched them handle a dangerous accident with calm and speed. I watched their children learn discipline before they learned fear. I do not believe humans have the same breaking point other species do. I believe we need to reconsider everything we think we understand about them before we engage them again. The Council did not fully agree with me that day. Many of the senior officers believed the encounter had simply been an unfortunate accident, made worse by a skilled but ultimately lucky human pilot, and that a larger, better prepared force would resolve the matter cleanly. Commander Kor, however, listened carefully to my report, and I could see something shift behind her eyes, a crack in the confidence that had defined her leadership since I had first served under her command. Word of the encounter spread quickly through the Accord's command structure, growing more distorted with each retelling, until the story that reached the highest levels of our council bore little resemblance to what I had actually witnessed. By the time the full council convened to discuss the matter, humanity had already been labeled a hostile threat, one that required immediate and overwhelming correction. I was called to testify before that council personally, an honor and a burden I had not expected so early in my career. I stood before dozens of senior officers and diplomats, species from a dozen different worlds gathered to decide the fate of a race they had never met, and I told them exactly what I had witnessed. I described the calm discipline of Haven Ridge, the skill of their pilots, the strange and unshakable confidence with which they had faced a fleet that outmatched them in every measurable way. They are not simply defending themselves, I told the Council. They are adapting faster than we can respond. If we approach this as a simple military correction, I fear we will underestimate them a second time, with far greater consequences. My warning was heard, but not fully understood. The Council agreed that a larger force was necessary, one capable of overwhelming any resistance humanity might offer, but they viewed my concerns as caution born from a stressful first encounter, not as a genuine warning about the nature of the species we were preparing to engage. Preparations began for what the Council called a corrective action, a fleet large enough to ensure there would be no repeat of the losses suffered at Haven Ridge. I was assigned to accompany this new fleet as an intelligence advisor, my knowledge of humanity's behavior deemed valuable despite the Council's dismissal of my broader warnings. Commander Kor requested me personally, and though I sensed a quiet respect had grown between us since the Council meeting, I also sensed her own doubts had not fully faded either. In the weeks that followed, as the corrective fleet assembled at a staging point 3 systems from human territory, I spent every spare moment reviewing what little information we had gathered about humanity. Their history, pieced together from intercepted communications and public records our linguistic officers had managed to translate, painted a picture unlike anything I had studied before. A species that had fought wars among themselves for most of their recorded history, yet had also built vast networks of cooperation, sharing knowledge and resources across their entire homeworld with a speed that suggested deep, practiced coordination. I found myself particularly struck by their history of conflict, not because of the violence itself, which seemed no worse than that of many species I had studied, but because of how quickly they recovered from devastating losses. Wars that should have crippled their civilization for generations instead seemed to accelerate their technological and social development, as though every setback simply became fuel for the next advancement. I shared these findings with Commander Kor during one of our final briefings before the fleet's departure. She listened quietly, studying the data on her display with the same careful attention she gave every piece of intelligence that crossed her desk. "You believe conflict makes them stronger," she said finally. I believe conflict reveals something in them that peace does not, I answered. I do not fully understand it yet, but I believe we are making a serious mistake if we treat this corrective action as a simple show of force meant to frighten them into submission. I do not think fear is a language they respond to the way other species do. Commander Kor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant, as though weighing my words against decades of experience that told her overwhelming force had never failed her before. "The Council has made its decision," she said finally. "Our task now is to execute it as safely as possible. I will keep your concerns in mind, Korvath. That is the most I can promise you." It was more than most senior officers would have offered, and I accepted it as the honest answer it was. 3 days later, the corrective fleet departed for human territory, over 4,000 vessels strong, carrying enough firepower, by every calculation our strategists had run, to end any conflict within a matter of hours. I stood on the observation deck of the Vera as we entered the fold, watching the stars stretch and blur around us, carrying with me a quiet, persistent unease that no amount of reassurance from my commanders could fully silence. We had already lost 2 ships and 11 lives to a single human patrol vessel and its small group of reinforcements. I could not shake the feeling that we were about to discover just how much we still did not understand about the species we were preparing to face. I did not know then that this fleet, assembled with such confidence and overwhelming numbers, would become the largest single loss our Accord had suffered in centuries. I only knew, as the fold engines carried us closer to human space, that the calm, patient warning I had given the Council echoed louder in my mind with every passing hour. We were not prepared for what waited for us, and soon neither would anyone else be. The corrective fleet arrived at the edge of human territory 11 days later, dropping out of the fold in a formation so vast it blotted out the stars along an entire section of sky. I stood beside Commander Kor on the bridge of the Vera, watching the tactical display fill with thousands of glowing markers, each one representing a vessel built and armed for a single purpose, to ensure that whatever had happened at Haven Ridge would never happen again. For the first hour, nothing moved. Our sensors swept the surrounding systems, searching for any sign of human activity, but the space around us remained eerily quiet. Commander Kor ordered a cautious advance toward the nearest inhabited human world, a planet our scouts had identified simply as the Third Colony, smaller and less developed than their homeworld, but strategically positioned along several major trade routes. "They know we are here," Drenisk said, studying the sensor readings with a frown creasing his features. "Their long-range detection arrays would have picked up a fleet this size well before we arrived." I did not doubt him. I had spent the journey studying every scrap of intelligence we had gathered, and one thing had become increasingly clear to me. Humans did not seem to rely on hiding or deception the way many species did when faced with overwhelming odds. They seemed to prefer knowing exactly what they were facing, however unfavorable the numbers, so they could plan accordingly. The silence lasted 3 full days. Our fleet advanced steadily through the outer systems of human territory, encountering no resistance, no communication, nothing but empty space, and the occasional automated beacon warning us, in calm and measured language, that we were entering claimed territory and should prepare to identify ourselves. Commander Kor ordered these warnings ignored. Per the Council's instructions, our fleet's mission focused entirely on reaching the Third Colony and establishing what our orders called a position of overwhelming presence. I found the silence more unsettling than any attack could have been. Every species I had studied before now reacted to an approaching fleet of this size with some visible response, whether panic, aggressive posturing, or desperate attempts at negotiation. Humanity offered none of these things. They simply waited, and their patience unsettled me more with each passing hour. On the 4th day, we reached orbit around the Third Colony, and I finally understood why the silence had felt so wrong. The planet below us showed no visible military presence at all. Our scans detected civilian infrastructure, cities and farmland, and the quiet hum of a population going about ordinary life, seemingly unaware or unbothered by the massive fleet now filling their sky. Commander Core ordered a full sensor sweep of the system, searching for the hidden defenses that surely must be waiting somewhere, camouflaged or buried beneath the planet's surface. We found nothing, no orbital defense platforms, no hidden fleets waiting in the shadow of nearby moons. Nothing but a quiet, undefended world, and a small, calm voice that finally broke through our communication channels, speaking in careful, practiced words that our linguistic officers translated within seconds. "This is Colonial Authority Third Settlement. We are aware of your presence. We ask that you state your intentions before proceeding further into our system." Commander Core ordered a response sent immediately, a carefully worded message explaining that our fleet represented the Ashen Accord, that we sought only to correct a recent misunderstanding regarding an earlier encounter, and that we required a formal meeting with human leadership to discuss terms for peaceful coexistence. The response came back within minutes, delivered by a voice that carried none of the fear I expected, only a calm, almost tired patience. "We understand. Please be advised that any further advance toward populated areas will be treated as an act of aggression. We would prefer to avoid further conflict." Commander Core turned to me, her expression a mixture of confusion and frustration. They have no visible defenses, and yet they speak as though they hold every advantage. I studied the message again, searching for some hint of the bluff I expected to find hidden within it, some tell that would reveal the desperation beneath the calm words. I found none. "I do not believe they are bluffing," I said quietly. "I believe they genuinely do not fear this fleet, even without visible defenses. I do not know what that means yet, but I do not think we should test it carelessly." My warning went unheeded, as I had come to expect by then. The Council's orders were clear, and Commander Core, despite her private doubts, was bound to follow them. 2 hours later, a formation of 200 vessels was ordered to descend toward the planet's surface, tasked with establishing what the Council called a demonstration position near the colony's largest city, a show of force meant to convince human leadership of the futility of further resistance. I watched from the Vera as the formation began its descent, and for the first time since our arrival, the planet's automated defenses activated. They were not the overwhelming weapons I had expected, nothing capable of matching the raw power of our fleet. Instead, I watched as a network of smaller, faster vessels launched from hidden positions across the planet's surface, weaving between our descending formation with the same sharp, precise movements I had witnessed from the lone pilot at Haven Ridge. These were not desperate, poorly coordinated defenders. They moved as a single unit, communicating in ways our sensors struggled to intercept, striking weak points in our formation with a precision that suggested extensive planning and preparation. Within 20 minutes, our formation had lost 30 vessels. 30 ships, each carrying dozens of crew members, destroyed by a defense force that our sensors had failed to detect even after days of careful observation. Commander Core ordered an immediate withdrawal of the remaining vessels, and as they retreated back toward the main fleet, I watched the human ships hold their position rather than pursue, exactly as they had done at Haven Ridge. "They are not trying to destroy us," I said aloud, more to myself than anyone else on the bridge. "They are trying to make us understand that pursuing this further will cost us more than we are willing to pay." Commander Core did not respond immediately. She was staring at the casualty report scrolling across her display, 30 ships lost in 20 minutes, more losses in a single engagement than our fleet had suffered in the previous decade combined. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight I had never heard from her before. "Send a message to the Council," she said. "Inform them that the situation requires reassessment before we proceed further." The Council's response, when it arrived 2 days later, carried none of the caution I had hoped for. Instead, it ordered an immediate escalation, authorizing the use of our fleet's heaviest weapons against any human military assets we could identify, with the goal of ending the conflict decisively before further losses could occur. I read the orders with a growing sense of dread, understanding that the Council still viewed this as a simple matter of applying sufficient force, still failing to grasp what I had been trying to warn them about since my very first testimony. The next engagement began 3 days later, when our fleet's heavy assault vessels advanced toward the Third Colony's largest orbital shipyard, a facility our intelligence suggested was responsible for producing the majority of humanity's military vessels. Commander Kor led the assault personally, believing that destroying this facility would cripple humanity's ability to continue resisting and force them toward the negotiations the Council still hoped to achieve. I remember the moment the assault began, watching from the Vera's bridge as our heavy vessels opened fire on the distant shipyard, its metal structure glowing bright against the darkness of space. For a moment, it seemed as though the Council's strategy might finally succeed. The shipyard's outer defenses fell quickly under the concentrated fire of our assault force, sections of the structure crumbling and drifting away into the void. Then the human fleet arrived, and everything changed. They came from every direction at once, vessels of every size and configuration, some clearly built for combat, others hastily converted from civilian transports and mining vessels, all moving with the same coordinated precision I had come to associate with human military tactics. I watched, stunned, as ships that our sensors had classified as unarmed cargo vessels suddenly revealed hidden weapon systems, striking at our assault force from angles our commanders had never considered defending. "Where did they come from?" Drenisk said, his voice rising with something close to panic as he studied the sensor readings flooding across his console. We had no indication of a fleet this size anywhere in the system. I did not have an answer for him. I could only watch as the battle unfolded before us. Our heavy assault vessels, each one carrying weapons far more powerful than anything the humans possessed individually, being overwhelmed not by superior firepower, but by sheer coordinated numbers and tactical precision. Every human vessel seemed to know exactly where to strike, exactly when to retreat and regroup, exactly how to exploit the smallest weakness in our formation. I watched a woman's voice, calm despite the chaos of battle, cutting through the human communication channels our systems had managed to intercept. "Hold the line at Sector 7. Do not let them reach the main structure. We can rebuild ships. We cannot rebuild the people trained to build them." It was a small thing, that single sentence, but it struck me harder than anything I had witnessed in the battle itself. These were not soldiers fighting simply because they had been ordered to. They understood exactly what they were protecting and why it mattered, and they were willing to sacrifice everything to protect it. I had studied dozens of species throughout my career as a scout, and I had never encountered anything quite like the clarity of purpose I heard in that woman's voice. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it finally ended, our assault force had lost over half its vessels, retreating in disarray back toward the main body of our fleet. The shipyard, though damaged, remained largely intact, its defenders having successfully protected the majority of its critical infrastructure. Commander Kor's own vessel had sustained heavy damage, forcing her to transfer command temporarily to a secondary ship while repairs were conducted. I found her afterward in the Vera's small medical bay, her arm wrapped in a temporary bandage from an injury sustained during the chaos of the retreat. She looked older than I had ever seen her, the confidence that had defined her leadership since I first served under her command, replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. "You were right," she said, before I could speak. "I did not want to believe it, but you were right. This is not a simple matter of force. There is something else driving them, something I do not fully understand." "I do not fully understand it either," I admitted, "but I believe I am beginning to see the shape of it. They do not fight because they believe they will win every battle. They fight because losing is not something they are willing to accept, regardless of the cost. I do not believe this fleet, however large, will be enough to change that." Commander Kor was quiet for a long moment, studying the casualty reports on the small display beside her medical bed. "The Council will not accept withdrawal," she said finally. "Not after losses like these. They will only see this as evidence that we need to commit further, to send more ships, more weapons, to end this decisively before humanity has time to fully mobilize." Her prediction proved accurate within days. The Council, upon receiving reports of the shipyard battle, ordered the deployment of our fleet's full remaining strength, along with reinforcements drawn from 3 neighboring systems, determined to end the conflict through sheer overwhelming numbers before humanity could adapt further. I remember reading the orders with a growing sense of despair, understanding that the Council was making the same mistake it had made from the very beginning, measuring humanity by their technology and their numbers, never once considering the deeper, more dangerous truth I had been trying to explain since my first testimony before them. As our reinforcements arrived over the following weeks, swelling our fleet to nearly 7,000 vessels, I spent my time reviewing every piece of intelligence we had gathered about humanity's history, searching for some pattern that might help us understand what we were truly facing. I found what I was looking for in an old historical record, an account of a conflict from centuries before their spacefaring era, describing how a smaller, less prepared human force had once held a defensive position against overwhelming odds, refusing to retreat even as their losses mounted, until the opposing force, exhausted and demoralized by the unyielding resistance, finally withdrew. The record included a quote from a commander who had led that ancient defense, words that had been preserved and repeated throughout human history for generations afterward. I read it to Commander Kor during one of our final briefings before the full fleet's advance began. "We do not fight because we believe we cannot lose," the quote read. "We fight because we have decided the cost of losing is one we refuse to pay." Commander Kor was silent for a long time after I finished reading it. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of understanding that I had not heard from her before. "Then this will not end until one side no longer exists to fight," she said quietly, "or until we find a way to convince them that losing is not the alternative we are offering." I did not have an answer for her. I only knew, as our fleet prepared for its final advance toward humanity's core territory, that the calm, patient warning I had carried since Haven Ridge had grown into something far heavier, a certainty that we were approaching a battle unlike anything the Accord had ever faced, against a species that measured victory not by the strength of their weapons, but by the depth of their resolve. And resolve, I had come to understand, was a weapon our fleet had no answer for. The final advance began at dawn by the Third Colony's local time, though dawn meant nothing to us aboard our ships, drifting silently through the black void above a planet that had already cost us so much. Our full fleet, nearly 7,000 vessels strong, moved forward in a formation designed to overwhelm any possible resistance, spreading across the system like a slow, unstoppable tide. I stood on the bridge of the Vera, beside Commander Kor, watching the tactical display fill with our own markers, an ocean of them, more ships than I had ever seen assembled in one place during my entire career. "Signal the human authority," Commander Kor ordered. "One final offer of terms before we proceed." The message went out, carrying the same demands the Council had insisted upon since the beginning, a full surrender of military assets and an acceptance of Accord oversight over human territory. I did not expect a different response than the ones we had already received, and I was not surprised when the reply came back within minutes, delivered by the same calm, tired voice that had spoken to us weeks earlier. Our answer remains the same. We would prefer peace, but we will not surrender our people to anyone. Commander Kor closed the channel without responding, and I watched something settle behind her eyes, a grim acceptance of what was about to happen. "Begin the advance," she ordered quietly. The battle that followed was unlike anything I had witnessed before, or have witnessed since. Our fleet advanced in overwhelming numbers, and for the first hour, it seemed as though sheer scale might finally accomplish what precision and coordination could not. We pushed through the outer defenses of the Third Colony, our ships absorbing losses that would have been unthinkable in any previous engagement, yet still advancing steadily toward the planet's surface. Then the human fleet arrived in full force, and I understood, for the first time, the true scale of what we had been facing all along. They had not shown us their full strength at Haven Ridge, or at the shipyard, or in any of the smaller engagements that had preceded this moment. Every previous battle had been a controlled response, a careful demonstration meant to discourage further aggression without revealing the true depth of their capability. Now, facing an overwhelming force that threatened everything they valued, humanity revealed a fleet larger and more capable than our intelligence had ever suggested possible. Vessels built in secret shipyards our scouts had never discovered, weapon systems that adapted and improved with a speed that defied everything we understood about technological development. I watched from the Veyra's bridge as the battle unfolded across every sector of the system, thousands of ships locked in combat, explosions lighting the darkness like a terrible, endless storm. Our numbers still outmatched theirs, even now, but the humans fought with a coordination and desperate precision that made every one of their vessels worth 2 or 3 of our own. I watched formations collapse and reform within seconds, watched pilots execute maneuvers that should have been impossible for craft of their design, watched commanders sacrifice their own ships to protect vulnerable allies without a moment's hesitation. A young man's voice broke through our intercepted communications during the height of the battle, his tone steady despite the chaos surrounding him. "This is Ethan, requesting immediate support at Sector 12. We are losing the line." A woman's voice answered almost immediately, calm and certain. "Hold as long as you can, Ethan. Help is coming." "There is no help coming," he replied, and I could hear, even through the distortion of our translation systems, the quiet acceptance in his voice. "Tell my sister I love her." The channel went silent moments later, and I understood, with a growing horror I had never experienced before, that I had just witnessed a man choose to hold a defensive position he knew he could not survive, simply because his sacrifice would buy time for others to escape. I had studied dozens of species throughout my career, species that fought fiercely for their own survival, species that valued their leaders and their strongest warriors above all else. I had never encountered a species willing to sacrifice so completely, so readily, for people they might never even meet. Commander Kor's own vessel took heavy damage 2 hours into the battle, forcing us to fall back toward the edge of the engagement to conduct emergency repairs. From this vantage point, I watched the wider battle unfold across our tactical displays, watched as our overwhelming numbers slowly, gradually, began to falter against the relentless resistance of a species that refused to break, no matter how great the cost. By the 6th hour of battle, our fleet had lost over 2,000 vessels. I stared at the casualty reports with a numbness that had replaced the fear I had felt earlier, unable to fully process the scale of what was unfolding around us. Commander Kor stood beside me, her face pale, her earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by a grim, exhausted resolve to see the battle through to whatever end awaited us. "We cannot sustain losses at this rate," Dren Isk reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "At this pace, we will lose the entire fleet within another 8 hours. Commander Kor did not respond immediately. She was staring at the tactical display, watching the battle continue to unfold, watching human vessels that should have been destroyed by our overwhelming firepower instead continue fighting, damaged but unbroken, their crews refusing to abandon their positions even as their ships fell apart around them. "Send word to the Council," she said finally. "We require immediate authorization for full withdrawal." The response, when it finally arrived hours later, carried the same stubborn refusal we had come to expect from the Council throughout this entire conflict. Withdrawal was denied. The Council insisted that our numerical advantage remained decisive, that continued pressure would eventually break human resistance, that retreat now would only strengthen humanity's resolve for future conflicts. I read the orders with a bitter, hollow anger I had never felt toward my own leadership before, understanding that the Council, safe and distant from the true horror of this battle, still could not comprehend what we were actually facing. Commander Kor read the same orders, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet, resigned defiance I had never heard from her before. "I will not send more of our people to die for a strategy that has already failed twice," she said. "Prepare the remaining fleet for a fighting withdrawal. We will save what we can." It was, I would later learn, an act of insubordination that would have ended her career under any other circumstances. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of a battle that had already claimed thousands of lives, it felt like the only decision that still made any sense. The withdrawal began immediately, our remaining vessels forming a defensive formation designed to protect our most heavily damaged ships as they retreated toward the fold point. I watched from the Veyra's bridge as human vessels pursued our retreating fleet, not with the reckless aggression I might have expected, but with the same calculated precision that had defined their tactics throughout the entire conflict, striking at stragglers and disabled ships, while allowing the bulk of our retreating force to escape without further pursuit. It was mercy, I realized slowly, watching human vessels break off their pursuit once our fleet had cleared the system's outer boundary. They had the numbers and the position to destroy our entire retreating force, to end this conflict completely and permanently in that moment. Instead, they let us go, content simply to see the threat to their homes removed, without pressing for the total annihilation that our own strategies had been built around achieving. The Veyra itself sustained heavy damage during the final hours of our retreat, a stray shot tearing through our secondary engine section and leaving us drifting at reduced power as we struggled to keep pace with the rest of our withdrawing fleet. Commander Kor ordered an emergency evacuation of non-essential personnel to nearby vessels, prioritizing the survival of as many crew members as possible over the preservation of the ship itself. I remained aboard through the final hours of that evacuation, helping to coordinate the transfer of wounded crew members to vessels with functioning medical facilities, watching as the ship that had been my home for years slowly emptied around me. Commander Kor remained on the bridge until the very end, refusing to leave until every other crew member had been safely evacuated, a final act of leadership that I would carry with me long after that day had passed. "You should go," she told me, as the last transport prepared to depart. "There is no reason for both of us to remain." "I am not leaving without you," I told her, and I meant it with a certainty that surprised me, given how carefully I had always guarded my own survival throughout my career as a scout. She studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "You have changed since Haven Ridge," she said finally. "I do not think you realize how much." I did not have an answer for her then, and I am not certain I have found one even now, recording this account so long after the events themselves. Perhaps witnessing the depth of human resolve, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the people and places they valued, had changed something fundamental in how I understood loyalty and courage. Perhaps it simply reminded me what those things were supposed to look like, stripped of the political calculations and careful self-preservation that had defined so much of my career until that point. We evacuated together on the final transport, watching from a nearby vessel as the Veyra, crippled and abandoned, drifted silently in the darkness behind us. Commander Kor did not speak during that final journey back toward the fold point, her attention fixed entirely on the tactical display showing the full scope of our losses. Nearly 3,000 vessels destroyed, tens of thousands of lives lost, in a single conflict against a species we had dismissed as harmless only weeks earlier. As our remaining fleet finally crossed into the fold and left human territory behind, I found myself thinking not of the battle itself, but of that young man's final words, spoken so calmly in the moments before his position was overrun. "Tell my sister I love her." It was such a small, human thing to say in the middle of such enormous violence, and yet it had revealed more about the true nature of our enemy than every tactical report and intelligence briefing we had gathered throughout the entire conflict combined. We had come to humanity's territory expecting to correct a simple misunderstanding, confident that our overwhelming strength would ensure a quick and decisive resolution. We left instead with a fraction of the fleet we had arrived with, carrying lessons about courage and sacrifice that I suspect the Accord would spend generations trying to fully understand. I did not yet know, as our battered fleet limped back toward friendly territory, that the true cost of this conflict was still unfolding, that the reckoning still waiting for us would prove far more significant than anything we had already endured. The journey back to Accord territory took 3 weeks, and I spent most of it in the medical bay of the transport vessel that had carried us away from the ruins of our fleet, tending to wounded crew members alongside the few medical officers who had survived the battle. Commander Kor visited often during those weeks, though she said little, spending most of her time simply sitting beside the wounded, offering quiet company that seemed to matter more than any words could have provided. We arrived at the nearest Accord outpost to find the news of our defeat had already spread ahead of us, carried by faster communication relays than our damaged fleet could match. The reception waiting for us was not one of sympathy or understanding. Instead, we found ourselves facing an immediate summons before the full council, an inquiry into what they called a catastrophic failure of leadership and strategy that had cost the Accord one of its largest fleets in recorded history. I stood beside Commander Kor as she gave her testimony before the council, watching her describe the battle with a clarity and honesty that I knew would not sit well with leaders who had spent the entire conflict refusing to acknowledge the truth I had been trying to warn them about from the very beginning. She spoke of the coordination and resolve of human forces, of their willingness to sacrifice everything rather than accept defeat, of the mercy they had shown in allowing our retreating fleet to escape rather than pursuing it to complete destruction. The council listened, but I could see in their expressions that many of them still did not fully grasp what she was describing. To them, the battle remained a simple failure of tactics and resources, a problem that could be solved with better planning and greater force in some future engagement. It was only when I was called to give my own testimony, describing in detail the words I had heard exchanged between human soldiers during the height of the battle, that I saw something shift in the room, a growing recognition that we were dealing with something far beyond a simple military miscalculation. I told them about the young man who had chosen to hold an impossible position, knowing he would not survive, simply to protect people he might never meet. I told them about the woman who had ordered ships to hold formation even as her fleet suffered losses that should have broken any rational strategy, understanding somehow that this particular battle mattered more than any calculation of acceptable losses could measure. I told them about the mercy shown to our retreating fleet, a mercy that made no strategic sense if the goal was simply to eliminate a threat, but made perfect sense if the goal was something else entirely, a desire to end violence rather than perpetuate it further than necessary. They do not fight because they enjoy violence, I told the council, my voice carrying a certainty that surprised even myself. They fight because they have decided that some things are worth any cost to protect. And once that decision has been made, there is no strategy we possess that can change their minds. We can only choose whether to continue paying that cost ourselves, or to find another path entirely. The council debated for many days after that testimony, and though I was not present for every discussion, I understood eventually that a fragile ceasefire had been proposed, communicated to human authorities through the same careful diplomatic channels that had failed so completely at the beginning of this entire conflict. This time, however, the offer came without demands for surrender or oversight, simply a request to end hostilities and establish a boundary between our territories that neither side would cross without invitation. I do not know exactly what convinced the council to finally change its approach after so many costly mistakes. Perhaps it was simply the staggering losses we had suffered, too great to ignore even for leaders as stubborn as those who had guided us into this conflict. Perhaps it was the growing recognition, spreading slowly through our reports and testimonies, that humanity's resolve was not a weakness to be exploited, but a strength that made them far more dangerous as an enemy than any species we had previously encountered. Whatever the reason, the offer was made, and to the surprise of many within our council, it was accepted. I was present, months later, when the formal agreement was signed, a quiet ceremony conducted through secure communication channels rather than any grand meeting between representatives. I watched as human leadership, represented by a woman whose calm, measured voice I recognized from the communications intercepted during the battle at the Third Colony, spoke words that carried none of the triumph I might have expected from a species that had just decisively defeated a fleet many times its own size. "We did not want this conflict," she said, her voice carrying through our translation systems, with a weariness that matched the exhaustion I had felt throughout the entire ordeal. "We do not celebrate what happened here. We only hope that both our peoples have learned enough from this experience to avoid repeating it in the future. I found myself thinking, in that moment, of everything I had witnessed since my first observation of Haven Ridge so many months earlier. The calm discipline of workers responding to an accident. The skill and precision of a lone pilot facing impossible odds. The devastating coordination of a fleet that had revealed its true strength only when everything they valued was truly threatened. The mercy shown to a retreating enemy that could have been destroyed completely. Every piece of evidence I had gathered pointed toward the same conclusion, one that I had struggled to fully articulate until this final moment. Humanity did not fight because they wanted power or conquest. They fought because they understood, with a clarity that few species possessed, exactly what was worth protecting, and they were willing to pay any price to protect it. Commander Kor resigned her commission shortly after the ceasefire was formalized, unwilling to continue serving under a council that had so thoroughly failed to heed the warnings she and I had both tried to provide throughout the conflict. I remained in service, though my role changed significantly, shifting from active scouting duties to a new position within our intelligence division, tasked with studying humanity more carefully, ensuring that the mistakes of this conflict would never be repeated by future generations of Accord leadership. It is in this role that I record this account now, years after the events I have described, hoping that my words might serve as a warning to any species who might encounter this record in the future. We entered this conflict believing that strength could be measured simply by weapons and numbers, that a species without our technology or our long history among the stars could pose no meaningful threat to a fleet as powerful as the one we assembled. We were wrong, catastrophically and tragically wrong, and that mistake cost thousands of lives on both sides of a conflict that should never have happened in the first place. I have spent the years since that conflict studying humanity more closely than any other species I have encountered throughout my career, and I have come to understand something I did not fully grasp during the chaos of battle itself. Their strength was never truly about their weapons or their tactics, impressive as those proved to be. Their true strength lay in something far simpler and far more dangerous, a willingness to place the safety and well-being of others above their own survival, a refusal to abandon a fight while anyone they cared for remained in danger, a capacity for sacrifice that our own culture, built around careful calculation and self-preservation, had never fully prepared us to understand or counter. I think often of that young man's final words, spoken so calmly in the moments before his position was overrun. "Tell my sister I love her." I do not know if that message was ever delivered, whether his sister ever learned of the sacrifice her brother made to protect people he had never met. But I have carried those words with me through every year since that battle, a reminder of exactly what we faced and exactly what we so nearly failed to understand until it was almost too late. No one who fought against humanity in that conflict emerged from it unchanged. Those of us who survived carry the weight of what we witnessed, a reckoning that forced us to reconsider everything we believed about strength, about victory, about what makes a species truly formidable among the stars. I do not know if the peace we have maintained since that conflict will last indefinitely, or whether some future disagreement might once again threaten to reignite hostilities between our peoples. I only know that if such a conflict were to happen again, I would counsel any leader who would listen to remember exactly what we learned at such a devastating cost. We did not lose that war because humanity possessed superior technology or because their numbers exceeded our own. We lost because we failed to understand, until it was almost too late, that we were fighting a species who had already decided, long before we ever arrived, exactly what they were willing to sacrifice to protect what mattered most to them. That kind of resolve cannot be measured by any scan or sensor, cannot be predicted by any strategic model, and cannot be defeated by any amount of overwhelming force. It can only be respected, and if we are fortunate enough to have learned anything from this costly encounter, it will be that respect, rather than conflict, is the only path that offers any hope of a lasting future between our peoples. This is my final account of the conflict that changed my understanding of strength and sacrifice forever. I offer it now, freely, to any species who might one day face a similar choice, in the hope that they might learn from our mistakes rather than repeat them. Approach humanity with respect, and you may find allies capable of extraordinary loyalty and courage. Approach them as a threat to be eliminated, and you will learn, as we did, at a cost too terrible to fully measure, that no one truly survives after fighting humans. Not completely, not without carrying the weight of what that conflict reveals about the true nature of courage, sacrifice, and the lengths a united people will go to protect everything they hold dear.